Good morning. Thank you for joining our session today. My name is Eric Trower. I'm a member of the marketing team at SICK. For those of you not familiar with us, SICK is the leading provider of sensor solutions. Today, Jeff Kropman, Market Product Manager for Profiling and Anti-Collision Systems with over 20 years of experience in the industrial automation industry, will be covering the topic of ultra-wideband localization. He'll discuss all that you need to know about the ultra-wideband technology and how you can use tag-based localization solutions to improve your material flow. Just a few points before we begin. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the Q&A box found on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll take some time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as time allows. Lastly, I'd like to mention that following today's presentation, a recording of this webinar will be emailed to each of you as well as those who registered but may not have been able to attend. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to our presenter, Jeff Kropman.
All right, thanks, Eric. Yeah, well, welcome everyone. And as Eric said, I'm going to give a little overview on ultra-wideband technology. So just to get a start to it, you know, we have a lot of different capabilities at SICK, and when we start the discussion on trying to understand where the different assets are and providing transparency and material flow, we usually sort of start with, well, we have some existing good solutions in the areas of track and trace. So we have barcode scanners and RFID, and so there's certain parts of the process that we handle, you know, every day today. But there are, you know, other areas where, you know, it's more of a fluid flow of the assets across the facility, and you can see there's a number of pain points that you'll be seeing every day. You know, so looking for assets, you know, that's a big one. You know, understanding the flow and how, you know, you're utilizing your equipment, like, you know, fork trucks or other material handling equipment. And those are areas that, you know, either cause delays or really aren't optimized. And so what I want to talk today is try a discussion on how can we bring a new technology into the discussion of where are we tracking the assets, and then how do we pull that information together. So I'll give an overview of our ultra wideband, and then how we can look at those partially or non-automated areas to help you understand, you know, the material flow and your assets throughout your facility. And really the goal would be to try to find some really good use cases, and then, you know, create the value that you need. And where we've looked at this, you know, one would be just, you know, kind of searching time and lost time. And we found that we're able to come up with like a 20% reduction in unproductive time, you know, searching time, lost time, and that sort of thing. And then as we talk a little further, you know, how can we kind of streamline and then integrate this solution into your systems? You're able to do things like faster audits, and then you're able to improve your overall quality and flow through your facility. So we'll look at some examples of that. And really to start, you know, want to start with a little discussion on where can we provide the value. And you know, I'll start with you know, looking at our portfolio. So as a wide sensor provider, we have a number of different technologies. And so this discussion starts with, hey, where are the most suitable localization technologies, and how do we apply those? And then the second step is, once you have some information that you're getting from these technologies, we want to help you visualize. So really, you know, where do you see these assets, and then provide analysis with a powerful software tool. And so I'll show an example of that, and we'll do a little demo at the end of the overview. And then third would be helping you understand how you integrate this into your business systems. And so that's really a heart of this discussion as well, because you'll be changing how you're doing things. And so, you know, we want to be able to work with you. So we're here as process and technology experts. We're going to help you with the consulting side to understand, you know, where your issues are, and then execution side with, you know, project managers and people to help you install and run these new systems. Okay, so if we look at the localization, there's really not like one size fits all, the technology. So start off, we'd want to say, you know, what a lot of people are using is an identification technology today. And that's really good, because that's saying, okay, which object is in the flow of goods? So you have a barcode or an RFID, you know that those goods are out there, and you've got that part of it taken care of. The part that we're adding with this technology is knowing where an asset, an identified object, is at any given time. So whereas our identification, you can have information on it, but you don't always have 100% transparency to that. So that's where this technology comes into play and gives you knowledge of where you are at any given time. And then the third part would be the analyze part. So then you get information, you can see where these are, and then you start understanding better where your flow is, where your materials are going. And really, the goal would be to derive an optimization. How can you make improvements in cost savings and better quality and the like. So that's kind of the combination that we're looking at here. So just to start off a little bit of, where are a lot of our technologies being used, starting with identification, this is good. We've got the goal of end-to-end transparency. So we are able to use the existing technologies for labeling and identifying assets. So it could be individual assets, it could be boxes of assets, boxes of parts and things like that. And our existing technologies like barcode scanners, cameras, and RFID are good technologies to use for that, because that's a proven use case, and everything is good. And that helps you understand, okay, which objects are basically in that flow and being used in your facility. Then if we switch that a little bit, we'd say, where would localization come into play? And this is where you can start adding, a new capability. So it really ultra-wideband, it provides good, precision, so you can understand exactly where your assets are. And with the technology, and I'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes, the technology provides some good benefits, for no interference and really low power. So that's really going to help you apply this and it operates safely. And there's kind of two main, kind of technology components that we'll talk to. The first would be the tags. So you can see tags there. There's a variety of tags that we offer, and those would be basically, attached to your assets. And if you think about it, depending on what type of asset it is, we have a couple different battery power options. So those could be just, if it's a cart, you can see there's like a pallet of parts there, something like that. And then we also have an externally powered one. So if you see a fork truck there, that could be tied into the supply, the power supply on your vehicle. So then, then it could just run from there. And within the tags, there's some options in that as well, and that there are some embedded sensors. So depending on your application, if you wanted to know the information about how that asset traveled, we have sensors like accelerometers, IMU, gyroscopes, and thermometers, so you get a feel for the conditions as well, if something, how that was moved and handled. And then there's some other, flexibility as far as some push button options on those tags as well. So really, that's the first part, getting a tag to provide the right information on that asset that's moving through your facility. And then the other part of the technology would be anchors, and think of those as those are the, you locate those across the, the walls and the ceilings of it. So it's really a grid of anchors, and then that's going to be the tracking device really. So it'll be picking up the pings coming from the tags, and then providing that localization. So I'll talk a little bit about the range in a couple slides, but have some different use cases for the range of it. They're powered over Ethernet, so it's pretty straightforward for connecting them and powering them up. And then really an important part is that robust synchronization. So we will set up the anchors in basically groups, and then understand the areas that you're monitoring, so we know either precisely or kind of an end-to-end type of a solution on where the different tags are moving through your facility. So, and there's a lot more information on that as well, and that we would pretty start your discussion on these are the kind of the core technologies we use, and then this is how we'd go about applying that. A little bit about ultra-wideband, just to kind of get everybody on the same page. So, our technology that we're using uses a time of flight sense, and so that if it sends out a signal, then it's the time that signal travels from the tag till that's picked up by the anchors there. And there's some really good features of our technology. The first would be the precision that I said. So ultra-wideband provides really good precision, 30 centimeters roughly, down to about a foot of accuracy there. So that helps you find exactly where your assets are at any given time as it moves. These assets move through your facility. The second part is looking at the table, kind of the bar to the right. The technology, it's a broad spectrum of frequency that it can be used in. And so, let me go down one more. We're operating in a, typically in about a 6.5 gigahertz. And as you can see, that's a different range than, say, LTE or Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. So there isn't interference with other standard, say, communications technologies that you're likely to have in your facility. And then the third would be low power. You can see the power of the ultra-wideband tags, for instance, are much lower than the other technologies. So that provides some really good value in putting this solution together. And then just to kind of show a visual of it is, so if we start with, say, a tag and there's these 3 anchors that are in a facility, the tag is going to be sending off a signal, and then you can see on the time of arrival, it takes a certain amount of time for that tag to submit, and then the anchors are all picking it up. And so what we do then is you see that each of the anchors has a certain time away. So if I click through this, you'll see that that time is then related to a distance, and then with at least 3 anchors, then you're able to triangulate where the location of the tag is. And then in our iteration of it, we call it a time difference. So we're basically, setting up the anchors and then coordinating that. So as the tag pings, then you can see it's really a difference. So it's basically a master anchor, say anchor 3 here, and then it's how much time delay is it from anchor 1 and 2 to that point. And so that's kind of the core technology. We take that information in, and then we compute those times, and then provide the provide the calculation for that location there. Okay, and then just a quick touch on the architecture itself. So you think of a facility, there's going to be an outline of the different anchors. So those are set up in some grid pattern depending on size and concentration that you'd need. And as I said, that's power over Ethernet. So those are brought into a switch, and then you'd have tags that are on the different assets that you're going to track. And then from there, you'd have cables, and that's all tied into a controller. And then within that controller, we have an Acidat Analytics, and I'll talk about that in a second. But that's really the heart of how does how do we use the information from the sensing area, and then provide metrics, and then provide linkages to your different business systems. So if we look at a kind of a typical facility, there could be a few different use cases that you would want to be able to understand the location of different assets. And if you look at kind of the mode, if you will, on the bottom there. So the first would just be a proximity. In this case, you're able to just say use one anchor in a, say maybe it's more of a storage room or something like that, or if you know that the asset goes into that room, you don't need to know exactly where it is, but you can understand where it, that it is in that room just by having a single anchor there. The second would be if you have more controlled flow. So in this case, you can see some aisles there, some kind of vertical aisles. And if you put anchors just really on either end, then you're basically going to have, the view would be up and down, that aisle. And so you could have 2 of them and then understand where the given asset would be, within that aisle. And then the third was just more of a general, where materials could be flowing anywhere around a certain part of your facility. And that's where you could see you could have a more of a grid, a pattern of where the flow might be. And then you'd set up, 3 to 4 for a given area to be able to localize that precisely. And so that would be more of a network of those, higher quantity of anchors to cover that material. So you can see, depending on what your use case is, there can be 1, 2, or even 3 different ways that you could apply the anchors to find the different assets that you have. And then, as I said, that kind of the key that we have in pulling this information together is our Acidat Analytics software tool. And this is important because the interface and the ability to visualize. So this is kind of an example of a demo. So I'll show this at the end. To know your facilities, you can do kind of a template of your facility there, and then watch your assets moving around. So there's some really nice capabilities here. That the screenshot would kind of be an example of live tracking. Where are your assets moving at any given time? And then the colors, there's a couple gold and then like a green and more of a purple. Those could be zones. So you can say, okay, this is where, might be an incoming area. It might be, a certain production area, something like that. So you can have zones, create zones and manage your flow with that. And then with rules and alarms, it gives you the ability to say, okay, if it enters this zone or if some condition happens, then you can alert and then send out that information about the asset. And then from there, as far as dashboards and reporting, you can have, I'll show a few examples, but there's reports. So the little report on the left-hand side of the screen would be a heat map report example. So you can see that it's kind of a green color as it flows evenly through, say, the pattern that that asset's moving. But if it has a dwell, then it gets, the longer it dwells, then the darker it gets. And you can see some red dots there saying that those are dwell points on there. So we have a number of kind of standard dashboards. And then as you go from there, there's the other capabilities, so looking at your assets so you can have the, understanding the devices. And then there's an API. So how do you get this information and tie that into your other systems? So you have you get the right set of information to the other tools that you use to manage your, your material flow and your inventory. Okay. So, again, our benefits, and I'll talk a little bit about, what is the big picture that we're doing. The first is seamless and location and then integration that into your system. That's kind of the key is we want to make sure that you're finding your assets and you're tying that information into your business system. The second would be enabling the, more automation in your material flow and your logistics processes. If you have better visibility of your assets, and you have a tool that you can integrate this information, then that helps you start automating, okay, how does that flow run, and obviously become a lot more productive in that way. Third would be business transaction tracking. So again, if you had zones, and if maybe entry points, start and stop points, things like that, then that that certain material is flowing, and then certain processes could be completed. So then you can get into that automation of where are your materials going, and how are you tracking it. And then the analytics tool, that's really key because it allows to look at your different, say, material flows and understand where can you make improvements, and really that's the other key of it is, okay, where are you having maybe bottlenecks, things like that. And the analytic tool really does help you say, okay, where can I make the right changes to things to be faster, reduce costs, whatever the need might be for that application. Okay, so that's kind of the technology side. The next part that I wanted to talk to is kind of like how do we look at the integration side, because that's kind of the other key point to looking at this. If we look at a given facility, I'll start kind of at the base level. So that would say be our localization. Where are the assets and how are they moving? So I've got a little explanation of where that can be. The second part would be your analytics. So how do you get the transparency that you're looking for? And then once you have transparency, can you make the material flows and some of your transactions more predictable? So you maybe have variances in how they flow, and if you understand transparency, then you can say, yeah, I can change how this is run and really improve that process. And then the third would be your kind of your business level. If you're bringing this information, and storing it and tracking it over time, then you can kind of look at how you control your material, and you have the charts, the analytics to prove it, and then that helps you get to a better level of automation in your process. Okay, so starting on just call it direct localization. So this would be we're tracking assets. It could be a robot, it could be a pallet, so a certain piece of equipment in your facility. The first is enabling our visibility. So here we're looking at real-time visibility. You're tracking your assets and you know where they are at all times. So that's really important. So you know where things are flowing. If you need to have transactions, you can say, yep, it's here, going from this part of maybe a work cell to to an inventory level. And that reduces the time that you would have to be spent just looking for things. And that's pretty much the first question that we get is, people are spending way too much time looking for, maybe not the everyday piece of material or asset, but something that's, maybe it's a little less commonly used, or it just gets misplaced in a certain flow, and then it sits there and either lost time or you have an issue with some delay in your process. And really where the localization system comes in time, so that's the real-time localization. So you're down to that, centimeter type accuracy. So you can go and find that really quickly and say, oh yeah, that's where that asset is, and you can act on it. So obviously your savings there would be time. You don't have to go out to, say the floor or a warehouse area and do, some long searches to get it done. And that's where from a you say the analytics side, you can track this information, and then you can filter based on, okay, which assets did you want to try to find, and really nail down to, this is the few that you're really interested in, and then make the actions on that quickly. The second part of kind of the visibility side would be your indirect localization. So in this case, it could be that if you look in the picture there, it could be that you have a number of different technologies that are already in place. So the left-hand side is kind of, you maybe have boxes and you could have barcodes on that or RFID. So you're using that technology, say on the cost-effective side to have your we'll call it high volume, low value assets. And then you can tie this into the ultra-wideband to say if you had a ultra-wideband tag on a cart, or something that then is moved in kind of the middle pictures there, then it's transported via an AGV or a tugger or something like that. That allows you to get that visibility, and that it's moving from one part of your facility to another one. So that's again, where you have flow of material. If you don't track that, then say you've got workers and they have a certain a route that they're taking, if there are delays there, or potentially it's stopped and maybe the something's unloaded or the cart is stuck somewhere, then again, you're going to have a lot of lost time. And then the way to do that then is, you'd still have your identification data. So you're able to kind of tie identification of, say, boxes of parts, to the RFU or RFID, say, and then and from there to the localization. So if you can kind of combine the technologies, that allows you to then track exactly where they are and where they're moving there. And that's really, becomes a better cost-effective way, because, where the identification's good is it's more in fixed locations, and you can see, yep, it's been here. But if you still have those gaps of where they're traveling, you're not able to understand where that's at. So that's a good way to do it. And then really in production, if you are waiting for items to arrive, and you had, obviously, if you're out of parts or something, then this is a way to then say, yep, I know where that shipment is coming, and you can find it and make sure that it's sent to the right spot. So it is, minimizing any kind of downtime there. So that's the visibility side. So once you have that kind of that core, you're tracking, you have your assets, and you're getting your information. The second part is we call generating transparency. And so this one then says, okay, now I have visibility, and I want to understand where my assets are going, and then how can I improve some of that flow. So things like a streamlined set of flow, that's going to help with kind of cost, as far as handling the flow of the material. It's also going to be more productive, so you're going to have a safer workplace, because where the assets are moving, and then you can set up your flows and your say if your inputs and your outputs with things like geozones to say, yep, that's where they're going to go, and then they're put in a predictable spot in the right location, and you're starting and you're ending in the right things, and then with that, then you can optimize how it's flowing. So again, the finding of the flow of a material, then okay, maybe what happened there. If something got delayed, you can look at is there a bottleneck in the flow or something like that. That's part of that. Getting transparency to your flow. Understanding as you review your process there, kind of the audit part. Where are you looking at the material flow? Finding where the issues are, and with those audits, then you can say, okay, yeah, this was a delay. Maybe that took longer than it should have, a certain movement of material. So then you can understand where those are, and then move that forward. And then, just the historic side of it, you have this data, so then you can track it over time and say, okay, how have your different material flows changed? And as you make improvements, then you can go back and say, yep, now I'm, this much faster or whatever compared to, data from, say, 6 months earlier, something like that. So I think that's an important part because you're getting then transparency, so you know where your material is. And then you're also gaining that insight into, where maybe some of the issues are. And so that's where the third part of the kind of digital transportation. And then that's where if we're starting to make things, predictable, make it intelligent, that hopefully then, increases your speed as you're moving the materials through. And that's really an important thing too, is you're trying to have, flexibility in all your manufacturing or your logistics operations. That shop floor, how do we get the material, through as efficiently as possible, so you have the best, throughput in your different processes there, and that's really important. So you have things like, you can see the geo zones there, so where things are going to be, and you're tracking that, and you have the right data. Then you can analyze that and say, yep, over time, this is how this flows. And then you can start adjusting things. If you know that it's predictable, then you can say, well, okay, maybe there's certain inventory flow, and you have, if there's buffers or something like that, you can work your way through that and say, yeah, I can optimize this and understand it. And so the results and the benefits here would be, you'd have shorter waiting times. If everything was predictable, then everything is flowing through at the right times, the right lot sizes, if you will, and then your transportation routes. You don't have those bottlenecks, or maybe there's some spots that just is tougher to get through. You can kind of work your way around that to work a lot more efficiently. And then as a result of that, you're going to have, reduced downtime. Everything that you work through should be faster and just less kind of lag in your system. So that's kind of the key there. And then as you go forward, then you can start looking at, how are things assigned. So as far as material flows, things are coupling or decoupling, where's it starting and stopping. So, all of those things with better predictability, then you can assign that stuff with a lot more confidence. So that's kind of the second part. And then the third part would be the control. As you look at this, then once you have your transparency, you're doing some analysis, then you're starting getting your flows, very predictable. Then you look at your systems and your kind of your overall business and say, okay, well, then are there places that you could automate things? Whereas before you maybe had a lot of either manual transactions or things like the paths that you'd choose. You can say, able to automate some of those process steps that would really help your efficiency as well, and really understand the whole logistics flow. So that's the first key. And then the second would be, if you have, in your automation side, standards, so you have a better plan to say, okay, this is how I'm going to do it. And then you can move forward with expansions and other changes that you're always going to be making, and have this as kind of your improved base case. So, benefits here of the localization would be, your workflows, you're moving that quicker because you've got automated steps. So again, less manual intervention to try to make decisions on it. And then if there is some sort of an issue, then you have that visibility, dashboards and the like, and you can say, if a new bottleneck comes up, then you can see, yep, that's how I act on it. Or if there's some sort of an issue with the process, then you say, yep, I see where the problem is, and you can address it. And then with this also, you have a good flow of information, and you're tracking it and storing it. So then you can bring a digital twin kind of environment and say, you can then simulate that and understand your flows as well. So it really does provide some really good information and helps you take steps to a digital kind of improvement arena. Okay. All right, so this is a little bit busy, but the use case is really where we want to kind of start the conversation. Where would you see as places that you'd want to make improvements? And that's really, the start of a conversation. So if you look at this, there's kind of three areas that we just covered. The visibility, so kind of a standalone system. Where are you finding the information? The middle would be kind of that transparency and predictable, so some data integration. And on the right-hand side would be control with full integration. You see the business value in these kind of cases, it goes vertically, so more value as you go up. And then the business effort on the x-axis, more complexity as you move to the right there. So you can see there's a lot of different examples of things that you can track. So this just the beginning, you're tracking, equipment, tools, some of the different types of, vehicles, MRs or trucks. So what is, where are your assets? So that's the simplest part, but you can start tracking that and understanding that flow. The second part is even more, so it's a lot to take a look at, but it would be, where are you providing transparency? So if you had things like, do you have the right tools in the right spots? Do you have the right throughput that you're looking for? That's really where you're streamlining a lot of your flows, and you're tying in some of that information for you. And then the third would be more, more complete integration and more, kind of overall control. So that's where you're getting, a lot more, of the analytics putting in place, and then you're doing things like the automated goods booking. So you're providing that as part of your process, and then that's going to be your streamline. So a lot of different bullets here. So hopefully there's something on there, probably in at least two of the buckets that you're looking at that triggers your, it's like, yeah, I see that every day, and that would be something that I want to do. So these are ideas of how we'd want to start a conversation with you to say, hey, where can we, start talking about this to help you, better provide, tracking and integration in kind of these three different areas. Okay, and then if we look at kind of the big picture, so this is, as you've seen there, it's a newer technology, and then we, in looking at it, would be probably working with you to tie a number of things together. So our typical kind of a solutions approach here would be a flow of, of a process. So, we would usually start with like consulting. So have a conversation with you. What are your goals? Where are some of your problems? What would you want to try to achieve with this? And then we'd go into probably a demo, so we'd start with, okay, let's figure out where we can apply this and make sense of it. And then work through kind of a typical project where, okay, let's find a spot to do this, project to implementation. And then once you get everything from an integration side, it's all up and running. So get it all up and going. And then, there could be, other services and maintenance as you go. So that's the kind of the typical flow. And that's common for what we do on a lot of our different solutions. And then on the other side would be, what are some of the technologies that we would work with? Kind of on that base level would be, our sensor technologies. What are the right localization, identification technologies that we would add for this? And then above that, you'd say, okay, how do you get the smart data? So that would be, okay, the tag information, could be the identification information. It could be other assets that you have. It could be, the information on your other moving assets that we'd have sensor data that we could tie in, or other assets. Just, if you need to know, maintenance or health, something like that, we can tie those types of things into this as well. And then the third would be, okay, then how do we aggregate that and provide what we call standards? So that would be some examples of some of those reports that I mentioned, and I'll show a demo of that just to kind of get a feel of kind of standard stuff that we do. And then if you need something else, we can always work out other details for kind of a customized service solution for that. So that's the typical flow. And then as we expand, we're going to have a few different examples. We're always working across industry to say what would be the right combination. So things like partnerships with SAP is an example of something that we're working on. To say, hey, if you're using the different ERP or MES systems, how do we get the right information back and forth? So we'll be working that. And then industry groups like OMLOCs that would have more standardization for technologies like ultra-wideband. So how do we get the right combinations of the different sensors and technologies together? So that's that's a typical flow, and we'd want to kind of work through this together to come up with that. Okay, so I'm going to switch now. Give me 1 second. Okay, so this is just a quick snapshot of it, but this is our Acidat Analytics, kind of a demo of our tool. So what I want to show is just a real simple click on a facility here. And you know, again, this is a demo site, but you can see this is our demo facility. So this was on that one of those first slides that I showed. So here's an example of basically a live view. So you can see just a couple assets running through here. You can see there are 4 anchors in that room, and you can see you know, ultra-wideband asset 1 and 2. So as they're flowing around, and it's, you know, just kind of a demo, so it's not, you know, not terribly complex, but you can see how it tracks through there. So that's like in simplest of terms, you know, that's your live view. That's how you can understand what things are doing. And then based on that, these are some of our standard reports. So I'll click on one just to give you an example, but, you know, a spaghetti map would just show the flow, just as, you know, because it's kind of a free-flowing asset, is squiggly lines like spaghetti running through your facility. The heat map I showed on that previous slide would be, you know, how does it flow, but then where are some of your dwell points? You'd have it from a light green colored up to a red based on, you know, how much time you have, and I'll just show you an example of a transport. So here we'd say we want to pick an asset, so I want to hit ultra-wideband asset. And I want to say, I think it's 1 to area 2, if I get that right. And you can do it over, and you can do, you know, periods of time. So just click, you know, plus 3 hours and generate. So what we have is the ability to then show how does it, anyway, try that again. Go to this one, hang on. How you can quickly understand. So this would be an example of zone retention. So if you had a zone, an asset moving into a zone or out of a zone, that's where you could really create some of your flexibility. So you can say, yep, I have certain, you know, certain geozones that you'd want. It could be, you know, an incoming point. It could be, you know, different steps along, you know, the different process, you know, after a sorting, you know, piece of equipment, or, you know, after a certain manufacturing step, then you know that the material is there, and then how long it takes, how long it was there, and then maybe how long it takes to get there would be some of your other. So these are just kind of simple reports. You know, how long it was in a zone, you know, round trip time. So if you have more repetitive flows, you can say, yep, this is one that went from, the pickup spot, and then it made a route to deliver material. You know that, say that, AGV, it took that much time to do. So those are examples of how you can make all of that work. And then your reports can say, yep, this is what you learn. And you know, from each of these, you're going to be able to learn quite a bit of, yep, that's where you have an issue. It took a lot longer for that step because, you know, whatever, a bottleneck. So you might combine your timing from a round trip and then take a look at, say, the heat map and say, you know, some round trips were super fast, then other ones were really long. You could look at the heat map at that time and say, yep, there's a dwell there because of you know, maybe it takes extra time for some sort of a step along the path, or it's a bottleneck of vehicles there. So I think that's an important part of the flow there as well. So that's the short view of the demo, and I'll just, you know, I'll try just one more. I don't know if this will come up. You know, and another example could be, you know, if you had multiple facilities. This is an example of an outdoor. So these demo sites are at some of our facilities in Germany. So as an example, you know, you could have, if you had multiple facilities and had, you know, tracking between them, you could have, you know, something like this set up as well. So there is some nice flexibility in the technology to say, hey, you would have ultra wideband for indoor, and we have a GPS technology for, you know, for tracking things that, say, could go between your different facilities. So that's just another example of how this, you know, how this technology can work. Okay, and then the other thing I just wanted to, so just kind of, you know, get some, you know, another piece of information. One of the other things, so this is just, you know, if you wanted to get more information here, you know, this is our website, and what I typically want to show here, if I can find this one. I won't do it now because videos are difficult to show via webinars, but this is a nice example of a few-minute video of our localization technology in use at our facilities in Germany. So I think it's about a 4 or 5 minute video. That's a really nice one to start, and we'll probably send that off to Eric with with a kind of a follow-up to this as a link there, so you can see that that's how we've been using the technology in a few of our different facilities, our manufacturing plants in Germany. So with that, I'm going to go back to the file. Okay. Okay, so now, that wraps up the material. So what I wanted to, go down one more, what I wanted to do is really open it up for discussion and any questions that you have.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I mean, you covered a lot there, and we actually do have a few questions on top of that.
Okay.
So let me start off here. The first one, it's actually a two-parter regarding the tags. So the first part is, did you say that these were passive? And the second part is, what are the dimensions of these tags?
Good questions. Okay, they're batteries, so they'd be an active tag, and the dimensions. Let me just go. If I have that, got a little more information here at the bottom. So we do this. This shows up okay. So here would be examples of tags. So they're the standard issue tags are in their millimeters, so like 3.5 inches by about not quite 2 wide by roughly an inch, inch high. So roughly that. And there's a few different iterations, as I mentioned there. Does that help? And again, this this information again is on the web page. There's kind of some tag and anchor information, with these types of specs that are on the web. And so, yeah, happy to help you with that.
Right. Good point. Okay, the next one, it looks like we can do another two-parter regarding the anchors. The first is, do the anchors need to be connected by wired Ethernet, or can they be connected wirelessly?
They are. Go back to the little architecture slide. Here's an example of one. We can use that. They are cables. So it would be the anchor would be a basically mounted to say your wall or your ceiling, and then there would be an Ethernet cable that goes from the anchor to a switch, and then from the switch to the controller. So it is not they're not a wireless device. Perfect.
The next one related to this is, can the tags be written to by anchors?
Not currently. That is something that we are looking at, because right now they're a one-way. The way that we've implemented and mentioned was time or else. So basically the anchors ping out, and then that the information is picked up, so that the ping is picked up by the anchor, but we're not going, not a two-way. There are other versions of ultra-wideband that provides that two-way, but our iteration right now does not.
Okay. And this question came in, I think, right when you were actually covering this final topic, but the question is, can the tag lock system be used outdoors? And you're talking about the two facilities there.
Yeah. No. Right now, it is an indoor solution. So we have on the roadmap to expand that, and so I guess the answer today we have a GPS technology that we can use. We have a gateway device that we've used in our facilities that you could add to, say, a vehicle, but the anchors themselves are not, and tags are not fully outdoor rated. So you wouldn't be able to put, say, them on like these anchors you see on, on poles or something like that outside. It's on, the roadmap to try to figure that type of a solution out. But this first iteration of our solution is indoor only.
Okay, great. Let's see here. Yeah, we have a couple more here. So this next one is regarding integration. It says, do you offer integration where we use RFID for assets, in this case boxes, via connector technology to recognize the boxes on a forklift and track the movement of the forklift with UWB?
Yeah, no, exactly. Because we would, and that's where that, as I said, you're already using either barcode or RFID. So that's where we can connect that and then bring the data, and then have these tags, say, on the fork truck. So that is a combination, and then all of that can be fed into the controller there, and the data is processed and provided via the Acidat Analytics. Yeah, that's the kind of that middle, we call it be like an indirect assets, where you have, say, smaller assets or boxes of stuff, say, with RFID, with multiple tags. But yeah, that would be a really good use case.
Great. The next one is regarding FCC, wondering if there is approval.
Yeah, so there's FCC approval. Obviously these devices are broadcasting, so FCC approval for the tags and the anchors. So and that's going to be almost every country would have some version of that. So a U.S.-based approval, probably different, slightly different in Canada or Mexico and other parts of the world. So yeah, so they would be these would all need approvals for wherever they would be operated. Yeah.
Okay, sure. This looks like it might be our final question, unless we have another one come in. And the question is, do you have tags with audio and visual signals?
Good question. We don't right now, but that's another ask for our roadmap, is to be able to have some sort of designation. That's where I think that either the two-way or some sort of a ping operation. But we're looking at that. But the current tags that we have do not. They're just kind of a one direction. They ping out, and then the anchors locate them, and then you'd need some sort of a handheld or a tablet to actually go and find that if you're walking through the facility, say, to be able to get to that. Right.
Sure. Okay. Great. I think that being our final question, Jeff, if you want to forward to the next slide, I think we have a little bit of information for the audience.
Yeah, let me find the right one here.
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Jeff, once again for presenting, and thank you to our attendees. Just a reminder to stay tuned for our next webinar, which is July 1st, presented by Phantom Auto. They're experts in remote unmanned vehicle operations. And they'll be speaking on the topic of remote operations and material handling, a pretty hot topic right now with labor shortages and all sorts of things, COVID-19. So I just want to let you know, you can always find the latest on our webinars via sick.com and in our newsletter. Thanks, everyone.
Good. Thanks, everybody.